Francesco.
Oh, yeah, sorry. Hi, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone, wherever in the world you may be joining us from today. My name is Francesco Del Carpio, and I am the CFA York Operations Coordinator. I would like to officially open the second session of the Environment, Social, and Governance in Practice speaker series with a land acknowledgement. We acknowledge and recognize that many Indigenous nations have longstanding relationships with the territory upon which our campuses are located that precede the establishment of York University. The area is known as Tikaranto and has been caretaken by the Anishinaabe Nation, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and the Huron-Wendat. It is now home to many First Nation, Inuit, and Métis communities. We acknowledge the current treaty holders, the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation, and that the territory is subject to the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, an agreement to peaceably share and care for the Great Lakes region. As this is an online event and our participants may be joining from various locations, I strongly encourage you to learn about the traditional land upon which you are located. With this, I welcome our moderator, our speaker, and our participants from around the world. Welcome to our webinar. Without further ado, it is my great pleasure to introduce our moderator, Dr. Jose Echeverry. Dr. Jose Echeverry is an associate professor in the Faculty of Environmental Studies. He is also co-chair of the Sustainable Energy Initiative, SEI. His work is focused on developing practical policy solutions to climate change through collaborative efforts, particularly in strategies to develop all renewable energy sources to their full potential and in finding new ways to communicate effectively about solutions to climate change and energy problems. Currently, Dr. Echeverry is working to address the climate change crisis by developing, both locally and internationally, an ecosystem of innovation focused on providing new practical opportunities for those interested in designing and implementing paradigm-shifting climate change solution parks using work-integrated learning approaches. Dr. Echeverry, thank you very much for moderating today's session. The floor is yours.
Grazie mille, Francesco, and hello, everybody. It is my pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker. But before I do that, in the tradition that Francesco mentioned, I want to acknowledge that I'm based out of Takaranto. So your land acknowledgement, it covers the place where I am. But I wanted to mention to you that we are in a place that illustrates everything that our speaker is going to be discussing. I'm speaking to you from Regent Park in Toronto, more specifically the World Urban Pavilion, where we're curating solutions to the problems that the human race are facing. More specifically, we're using the Sustainable Development Goals to address a number of crises that the human race is experiencing. In a practical way, using principles that can be replicated throughout the planet. So we thank the people that made this space possible, and we welcome you anytime you want to visit the World Urban Pavilion in Regent Park. So it is my pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker. I'm not sure if Dr. Ali Askari will say a few words before the speaker, but I wanted to mention that ESG, it's not a theory. It's actually become a practice that ensures that the world can be run in a way that will ensure that we continue to have a planet. The planet has existed way before humans, and it will continue if humans cease to exist. But ESG allows us to be able to continue to develop as a species without jeopardizing the viability of the only planet that we have, that is called Earth. So you will be hearing some very practical things from our speaker. And I don't want to steal his thunder, other than saying that he's a scholar and a gentle person. He runs his activities using approaches that are conducive to the preservation of the planet. And I think we're going to be regaled with a story that you will want to tell your family and friends about. So I'm giving the floor to Vibhor. We're very informal people here. We believe in horizontalism, not verticalism. You can call me Jose. And I'm not gonna have time to introduce the people that are with us, but I do wanna acknowledge my colleague Abby that is also here in the Urban Pavilion, and the other Jose Echeverry that is not me, but it's my colleague Mariam that is also here in the Urban Pavilion. Dr. Ali Ascari, he's in mute, but he's of course the head of CFAO York, which is the most spectacular satellite of the United Nations Institute of Training and Research, because it's based right here out of York region in Canada. So Dr. Vibhor, your floor is yours. So tell us a little bit about yourself and then launch into your presentation.
Thank you very much, Francesco, Dr. Jose, and Dr. Ascari. It really is my pleasure to be here. I commend this initiative, and I think the speaker series is very important as it facilitates knowledge transfer at a time when we're seeing a lot of misunderstanding, but also politicization of ESG. For instance, if you think of what's happening, for instance, in the US. So before I share my screen, I'll just give a quick introduction about myself. My name is Vibhor. I'm an associate at ESG Global. I've been in this industry for about 3 years. And then before that, I finished my master's in sustainability management at the University of Toronto. So I'm going to share my screen now, and over the next sort of little bit, we'll talk about ESG strategies and why they're important, but also how organizations can develop ESG strategies. So bear with me while I share my screen here. Francesco, can you please let me know if you're seeing the right screen?
Yep, it looks good on our end here.
Okay, great. Awesome. So hi, everyone, and welcome to what I hope will be an informative session on ESG strategy. Over the next half an hour or so, we'll be talking about the what, the why, and how of ESG strategies. We'll also talk about some key takeaways at the end of the presentation, and then we'll leave plenty of time at the end for some questions. So before we get started, I just wanted to give a rather shameless plug about my company, ESG Global. So we're a boutique ESG advisory firm that works with both investors and corporations on a range of different ESG services. One of them is ESG Strategy Development. So as an associate, I get to work on a lot of the execution on these projects, and really just getting down in the nitty-gritties of ESG strategy. So happy to answer any questions about the firm as well that you may have at the end of the presentation. So with all that out of the way, let's get right into it. And the first question we'll ask ourselves is, what is an ESG strategy? But before we can talk about ESG strategies, I think it's important for us to align on a definition of ESG. And this is important because, as you may all know, ESG is a very co-opted term. It means different things to different users of the word. And so I think at the very start of this presentation, it's important to level set on the definition of ESG that we'll be using throughout the presentation. So this definition that you see in front of you, and I'll read it out in a minute, it comes from the capital markets. So it's the definition of ESG used by, for instance, securities, commissions, and regulators. And it goes something like, environmental and social risks, opportunities, and governance practices, they're not typically valued in financial terms, but that have the potential to materially impact financial performance or business value. So a couple of things to focus on here. The first thing is that ESG is both about risks and opportunities. Most of the time, I think it's a common misconception to think of ESG just as a risk, but it's also very valuable to think of ESG as an opportunity. Secondly, the focus is on financial materiality, which just means that these factors can impact an organization's financial performance and business value. So these factors can impact things like profitability, revenue, and perception. And this concept of materiality is significant as it allows us to differentiate ESG with distinct but related terms such as CSR and sustainability. So in a nutshell, CSR is focused on company values. It looks at topics that are important to stakeholders and the impact of the company on the environment and society. So with CSR, you take more of an inside-out approach. ESG is different because you're looking at the focus, you're looking at the impact of social and environmental factors on the company. So it's more of an outside-in approach. And specifically, you're looking at how these factors impact financial performance and business value. So sustainability then lies at the intersection of CSR and ESG. It's more of a holistic term, whereas CSR and ESG are more specific. But again, for the purposes of this presentation, we'll be focusing on ESG and the lens of financial materiality. So now that we have a definition of ESG, we can define ESG strategies. So an ESG strategy is a set of tools, processes, policies, and actions that enable an organization to mitigate ESG risks and capture ESG opportunities that have the potential to materially impact financial performance or business value. Again, we're capturing ESG opportunities, but we're also mitigating ESG risks. And again, you have that lens of financial materiality. So I'm going to pause here for a bit just to make sure we're aligned on the definitions of ESG and ESG strategy. If you have any questions or comments on this topic before we proceed, please feel free to type them in the chat. And I'll make sure to spend some time clarifying those because I think it's important to understand these concepts before we proceed. So Francesco, please let me know if there's any questions that come up, and I'll just wait for a few seconds to proceed with the next item.
Sure. I'm not seeing anything right now
Great.
in the Q&A.
Okay, that's okay. We can always come back to it at the end as well when we have the questions and answers period. So now that we know what ESG is and what ESG strategies are, the next question that we're going to tackle is why have an ESG strategy in the first place? And there's a variety of socioeconomic drivers for ESG that we're going to talk about. And the first comes from the World Economic Forum's 2023 Global Report. So every year, the World Economic Forum takes an annual survey of perceived global risks, and consistently over the past few years, it has ranked environmental and social issues at the top of these lists. Even in this year's report, 5 of the top 10 most severe risks on a global scale over the next 2 years are environmental, and this trend is predicted to continue over the long term. So again, this slide is just trying to say that there's some really significant global risks that are elevating ESG factors. And there's a particular focus on things like climate change that can potentially impact a company and an organization. Another driver that we're seeing is over the past 50 or so years, we're seeing that the market value for S&P 500 companies is increasingly being driven by intangible assets. So things like intellectual property, goodwill, or brand recognition, all of which are increasingly influenced by ESG factors. So you can see this graph here. In 1975, only about 17% of a company's value was attributable to intangible assets. But in 2020, this rose to almost 90%. So you can clearly see that the value and importance of ESG factors is increasing over time. Another sort of significant driver of ESG has been the regulatory environment. We're seeing pressure from regulators for more transparent and robust disclosure. And we're seeing a number of different players in this space that are asking companies and putting pressure on companies to disclose transparent and robust information. So a couple of bodies I'll talk about here. The first one is the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures. So this is an organization that has a framework for the disclosure of climate-related risks and opportunities. So a company that is particularly impacted by climate change can look at the TCFD recommendations and see what metrics and topics it should report on for climate change. Another example I'll give here is the International Standards Sustainability Board, the ISSB, which has been working very hard over the past couple of years to develop a global baseline for sustainability reporting. And in June of this year, they released their first ever sustainability disclosure standards for climate change and general sustainability. You may have seen these on your LinkedIn over the past couple of months. And I think this was also one of the topics the speaker last month spoke about. We're also seeing pressure from investors who are increasingly integrating ESG in their responsible investment or decision-making process. So we're seeing that responsible investment approaches are becoming increasingly more widespread and mainstream. And as evidence of this, consider this graph that shows the rise in signatories to the UN-supported Principles for Responsible Investment, which is a voluntary framework that investors can sign on to. So as part of this initiative, signatories will agree to follow 6 principles. One of them is to consider ESG factors in their investment decision-making process and seek ESG disclosure from their issuers. So as you can see from this graph here that plots assets under management over time, you can see that the number of signatories to the UNPRI has increased over the past 15 or so years, and we're seeing more of ESG decision-making by investors as well. Finally, another driver that I'll talk about is the increasing focus on the S side of ESG. So remember, ESG stands for environmental, social, governance. We're seeing that ever since the pandemic, there's been an increasing focus on social issues. And this has coincided with things in our Canadian context as well. You look at, for instance, Indigenous reconciliation and some of the events of systemic racism that we've seen in society. All these issues are really coming to the forefront, and now we're seeing strong focus from companies on managing, but also disclosing how, for instance, they engage employees at work, what are their health and safety practices, what are their labor practices. So we're increasingly seeing more disclosure and expectations for companies to do better on the social side as well. So these were sort of the main drivers of ESG. Again, we're seeing a lot of investor pressure, an increase in the S side of ESG, but also some regulatory pressure. So all these are drivers for why an organization should have an ESG strategy. And again, before proceeding with the next section of the presentation, I'll again pause here just to make sure I answer any questions or comments that anyone has. So again, Francesco, if you can let me know if there's anything you see in the chat, that'll be appreciated.
Yeah, there's just one question here. What is the liaison between ESG and the growing intangible values of companies?
Yeah, that's a good question. So ESG, if you look at the specific topics within ESG, there's a lot of things that fall, for instance, under the governance aspect, right? One of these topics is like intellectual property, or how an organization manages boards and sort of board practices. So a lot of these things are difficult to quantify because they're qualitative in nature. And we're seeing that now a lot of investors are asking for disclosure on these specific topics. And so that's why we're seeing investors, for instance, who think that an issuer faces a lot of risk from the governance side. We're seeing that investors are not putting money into those companies. So you can clearly see that there's some sort of link between ESG and investment decision-making, and ESG and where sort of money is going from the investors. And that was the link that I was trying to show in that slide. So hopefully that answers your question, but if not, I'm happy to sort of answer that at the end as well. So I don't see any other questions for now, which is okay. We can come back to that at the end. Let's proceed now with sort of the final section of this presentation, which is how to devise an ESG strategy. So there are 5 major steps an organization can take to develop an ESG strategy. And we'll go through each of these 5 steps in detail. So the first step is to conduct an ESG materiality assessment. So an ESG materiality assessment forms the foundation of an ESG strategy. And through materiality assessment, an organization does 2 things. 1, it identifies a list of its most material ESG topics. And 2, it identifies the relative priority of these ESG factors. So organizations can identify material ESG topics through a range of different activities. One is surveys with employees or board management. Another is interviews with, for instance, customers. And we're also seeing now that there's increasingly sector-specific guidance produced by various bodies that lists out which topics an industry should consider if, for instance, it's in the oil and gas sector or the mining sector. So once an organization identifies its material topics, the next step is to establish an organization's ESG vision and objectives. And an organization can do this by answering a number of questions. The 2 most important are, why is ESG relevant to the organization and its industry? And how is ESG aligned with the organization's mission, vision, and values? So these are really important questions to consider. And at this stage, it's recommended that companies incorporate the viewpoint of internal stakeholders, especially the board and senior management, because they often have the best insight and influence on an organization's overall business strategy. So the third step is, once you've identified the list of ESG topics and you've identified your ESG objectives and vision, the next step is to integrate this into your internal strategy and risk management. So for instance, when you're thinking of financial planning or capital allocation, we must put on our ESG lens and think of the costs and financial benefits of ESG risks and opportunities. As another example, when you're thinking of risk management, you should treat an ESG risk as any other type of business risk and incorporate that into the internal risk register. Finally, once you have all these topics that you've agreed upon internally, you've incorporated ESG into your internal strategy, now you can start to produce reporting to show that you're thinking about these things to important stakeholders, such as investors, who increasingly look at sustainability reports of companies when considering which investment decisions to make. So a lot of organizations who are starting out on this process may find it difficult to start. There's a lot of things to report on, and sometimes an organization is not sure what should be prioritized. But luckily, we're seeing there's a lot more guidance out there for reporting of this information. So one of the organizations that you would have seen a logo in one of the other slides is the Sustainability Accounting Standards Board. So what this organization does is it produces sector-specific guidance for organizations to look at, which lists what topics the organization should consider material and what metrics should the organization report on for these topics. So for instance, if I'm working at an oil and gas company, I would look at the SASB oil and gas standard, and I'll open the standard and I'll see what topics are there for me to report on. So for instance, greenhouse gas emissions or community relations. And then it'll also have metrics for each of these topics. So for greenhouse gas emissions, it'll be like scope 1 and scope 2 emissions. For community relations, it'll be, for instance, the amount of investment in the community. So once I have those metrics, I'll make sure within my team to find out who are the owners for this data. I'll get all that data and I'll put it in a report, and then I'll sort of comply with the relevant standard. So that's how sort of organizations can get started with sustainability reporting. And then finally, when all these parts of this ESG machine have been assembled, we have to make sure that this machine keeps running. And the best way to do that is to continuously monitor your progress on ESG performance and make any adjustments as necessary. So both the management and the board plays a role in this process. And both of these stakeholders are in constant communication with each other. They're discussing things like performance on KPIs, performance on key trends, if there's any major developments in terms of ESG in that industry. These are all things that both the board and management is aware of, and they continuously keep changing their ESG strategy based on these developments. So I know we went through a lot of information in this short period of time. I want to make sure we have plenty of time for questions. So I'll conclude with a short list of key takeaways from this presentation, in particular about ESG strategy. So the first point I want to mention is that ESG strategies are unique and fit for purpose. They should align with an organization's operation and internal structure. The second thing I want to mention is that the road to develop an ESG strategy is long. There are multiple steps that span a multi-year timeline. And the best way for organizations to approach an ESG strategy is to take a phased approach. So to follow the 5 steps that I outlined in each step. The third is that ESG strategies are stakeholder-centric, which means that they should be driven by the priorities of key stakeholders. When an organization is developing an ESG strategy, they should make sure that they take perspectives from their employees, their board, their senior management, and any other stakeholders that they identify as being important to them. Finally, an ESG strategy should compose an integrated approach. An organization should leverage key expertise and resources throughout internally throughout to make sure that these resources are being used for ESG strategy development. So thank you very much, everyone, for listening to my presentation. I'm happy to answer any questions that you may have. And yeah, looking forward to our discussion here. So please feel free to drop your messages in the chat, or if there's ability to unmute yourself, I'm happy to answer questions that way as well.
Okay, while we wait, thank you so much, Vibhor. That was wonderful, very, very well explained. So until other questions come in, I'm gonna ask you a very pragmatic question, which
absolutely,
in your personal opinion,
yeah,
what would be the top ESG leaders that we should actually be paying attention to?
Yeah, it's a very good question. And I think, you know, it depends largely based on which industry you're looking at. So I'll give an example of, for instance, the technology sector. So increasingly, we're seeing a lot of these big tech companies incorporate ESG into their decision-making process and their operations. And one example that always comes out as a leader is Microsoft. So for anyone interested, I think it's a very good exercise to go through Microsoft's sustainability report and to see what kinds of topics they're looking at. With all this sort of AI technology in the past couple of years, we're seeing a lot of risk from AI in terms of piracy and cybersecurity. So a lot of companies like Microsoft are trying to tackle AI risk through their sort of ESG strategies. So that's a leader that comes to mind. From a Canadian context, there's a number of oil and gas companies as well. You know, as Canada is a heavy relier on energy imports and exports, particularly exports. A lot of oil and gas and mining companies have very strong ESG strategies in Canada because that's what they require for investors to keep funding them. So I encourage everyone to look at sustainability reports for oil and gas companies as well. So for instance, like Suncor. So those would be sort of some of my examples there.
I see the chat box, and
yes.
I think Francesco is paying attention to it. And before we go there, but Vibhor, here's a company that I want to highlight,
sure.
and you tell me, and I don't own stock in this company. I don't know if they're even traded, but it's called Patagonia. Patagonia, it's a family-owned company.
Yes.
And the story, it's an important one for everybody attending. They should look at it. But I wanted to bring it to the attention because they're taking this conversation to the next logical level. Wouldn't you agree?
Absolutely, absolutely. Patagonia is one of the leaders in sort of the fashion space and sort of the consumer space, because I think for Patagonia, ESG is not only something that they do, but it's very incorporated into their business strategy. So you look at their co-founder, he's made a number of different commitments on ESG, and I think he's going to donate substantially a lot of the profits made from the organization to sustainability efforts as well. And Patagonia is one of those companies that you see like sustainability and ESG part of every single thing that they do. So a lot of their clothing is made from recyclable material. They have a lot of different community initiatives as well. So absolutely, for anyone who doesn't know about Patagonia or the sustainability efforts, I do recommend you find out about that, because it's, yeah, as Professor Jose mentioned, one of the leaders in this space for sure.
And we're going to take questions now from the audience, but I wanted to point out to everybody in the audience that there's also a network. If you Google 100% renewable energy corporations, this is a network of the largest corporations. Some of them are small, some of them are very large, like, for example, Apple, that have made a commitment to go for 100% renewable energy in their operations. So this is a network that here in North America, it's not as known as it is, say, in Europe. But I wanted to bring it to the attention while you're taking questions, I will put the link on the chat box so everybody can have it. But it is very important to celebrate the companies that are going beyond the call of duty of ESG and create a new model. I'm going to finish with a company that is a little obscure for people because it's new. It's called GeoSheets. And what they've done is they've turned the model upside down. They capitalize themselves first with principles of sustainability, and they will be the equivalent of Tesla, what Tesla did for electric vehicles for sustainable home construction. So I'll leave it as that, as a teaser for people to look in the internet. And Francesco, myself, we will be looking for questions in the chat box. I'm not sure if folks can unmute themselves to ask questions, but Francesco can clarify whether people can do that or not.
Yeah, if anybody would like to ask their question, they can raise their hand and I'll give them permission to talk. Otherwise, if you want to, I see some questions in the chat, but if we could try to keep the questions in the Q&A and the chat for more general comments, that would be great. But I see 3 questions in the Q&A and I believe another 3 in the chat right now. If you want to go ahead, Jose, and start with any of the questions.
Great. Yeah. Should I start with the ones in the chat first, maybe?
Yeah, please go ahead. That's the easiest because I'm trying to put links to the things I say. So
Sure.
feel free, Vibhor, to take the ones you see.
Sure. So let's start with the question asked by Amanda here. What would be your 3 hot tips for operationalizing ESG within companies? That's a great question. The first tip I would give is to make sure that the value and importance of ESG is aligned internally within the key stakeholders of the organization. A lot of times ESG efforts are stalled, or they don't get started, or they get cut off because senior management, especially for instance, board of directors, don't have confidence in the organization's capabilities to work on those sustainability efforts. So I think it's very important for organizations to incorporate that perspective from senior decision makers. So that's number 1. Secondly, I would say organizations should keep a track of what their peers are doing and what their top investors want in terms of ESG. A lot of times you're competing with similar companies for funding, and ESG is one of the ways that you can differentiate really from other competitors. So I would look at sort of competitors and investors as well. And then finally, I would say another hot tip would be just keep sort of monitoring your ESG performance. The ESG industry is very dynamic. There's a lot of changes that come out almost every day. So it's very important to be aware of whatever is happening in the industry and make sure you're catering your ESG strategy accordingly. So Amanda, I hope that answers your question. Let's go to Gabby's question, which is pretty long, but I'm going to read it. For private companies that may start to be impacted of residual reporting from key vendors, suppliers, or banks within their value chain, how can they best prepare for disclosure requests, especially if you do not have capacity or budget to establish a sophisticated ESG strategy? So I'm not quite sure if I understand that question from Gabby. If we have her in the chat or in the audience, Gabby, if you don't mind just clarifying, I'm happy to answer your question.
Gabby, if you're there and if you have a microphone and you'd like to clarify your question by speaking directly with Vibhor, we can unmute you. If not, feel free to clarify in the chat and we can move on to another question while we wait for that. Do you want to move on to Harsha's
Vibhor,
question?
I think...
Sorry, go ahead,
I
Jose.
think it's an important question, Vibhor. And the best way I can paraphrase it is, let's say, for example, that the European Union starts demanding that producers of imports into the European Union have low or zero carbon content. Well, let's say a company that is in South America making wine, all of a sudden will be actually covered by that regulatory regime. So the question is, how
Absolutely.
can they do that if they don't have their own ESG strategies? That's the best way I can paraphrase it. But
Absolutely.
Gabby maybe has a different take.
Yeah, that's what I was looking to understand. I think, again, some of the smaller companies that are going to be impacted by, let's say, emission disclosure requests or human capital disclosures, if they don't have the capacity or team to be able to create a more, comprehensive ESG strategy, how can they kind of take some bite-sized approaches to prepare for the disclosures within their value chain if they're not falling under a regulatory body that is going to require them to have ESG disclosures?
Absolutely, and it's a good question, and thank you, Professor, for clarifying. I think the first step to do here is to make sure you're mapping your value chain, your supply chain, identifying sort of your tier 1, tier 2, tier 3 suppliers. And once you have sort of an assessment of your overall value chain, depending on sort of if you're based in different countries, the next question is to integrate your sustainability considerations in your supplier code of assessments or sort of supplier policies and practices. And we see, for instance, a lot of consumer goods companies are increasingly doing that as well, especially those with very long value chains. You have specific sort of ESG focused questions and commitments in your supplier policy and supplier code of conducts. We're also seeing increasingly that organizations are setting specific supply chain disclosure target requirements for you to work with like a company. So for instance, an organization can set up a requirement such that the supplier that supplies goods to the organization must have an emissions reduction target of, for instance, 30% emissions by 2050. So some of these ways, some of these methods are what we're seeing that organizations are doing to really sort of identify and mitigate ESG risk in the supply chain. Thanks, Gabby. That's a good question. Let's move on to Harsha's questions. How can the UN SDGs help define and shape ESG outcomes? Thank you, Harsha. That's a good question as well. So UN SDGs, this is my sort of opinion on the SDGs. I think they're great. They're a nice tool, especially when you're reporting to a broad set of stakeholders. I do think, though, that the UN SDGs don't provide a lot of financially material information. So a lot of the investors that we work with, they don't overemphasize the importance of SDGs compared to something like TCFD or like SASB standards, which are more financially material. So SDGs, they're good in the sense that they're extensive. But a lot of times we're also seeing that reporting with SDGs is not transparent or not properly done throughout organizations. Like some organizations report very specific SDG level information at the indicator level, but some would only do it at sort of the goal level. So there's inconsistent reporting with SDGs, which I think is one of the reasons why there's a limitation to how much you can sort of shape ESG outcomes compared to other sort of standards and disclosure frameworks that are more financially material. So I hope that answers your question, Harsha. From Leonora, what do you believe are the main challenges for companies when trying to improve their social pillar in Canada? That's another great question. I think the biggest issue with disclosing social issues and disclosing on social metrics is that a lot of times social information is difficult to quantify, right? Like how do you measure employee engagement, or how do you measure employee health and safety and well-being? And typically, a lot of times what you can't measure or what you can't define, you can't measure, right? So increasingly now we're seeing with sort of a lot of social unrest and civil movements, we're seeing regulators preparing more guidance for companies reporting on social issues. So for instance, there's a report that I can send a link in here. It's called The State of Social in ESG, and ESG Global, my organization, was one of the authors for the research. We did a survey where we tried to find out how organizations are reporting on social issues and what are the metrics that they're using. And we found that there's been an increase in the number of reporting and the type of reporting on social issues, but there's still challenges remaining in this space, such as the quantification of social issues. So yeah, I would say the main challenges are just sort of defining and measuring social issues. But the good news is that there's more guidance out there nowadays to improve on these challenges and to address them. I think we answered Jose's question on SDGs and ESG with the other question above. Professor, I saw you drop the links here in the chat. That's great. Yeah, maybe we can move on to the questions and answers in the Q&A sort of chat box. We have a question from Gigi here. What do you say to managers who are uncertain about why a strong ESG strategy has a business case? Yeah, that's another good question. I think it's important, as I mentioned, to incorporate the decision-making and perspective of senior leaders when you're trying to develop an ESG strategy. And for those who don't believe in sort of the merits of an ESG strategy, I would just point out to, for instance, a lot of the research that we're seeing these days from major institutions and major investors saying that ESG is increasingly driving their investment decision-making process, or that ESG is driving sort of their financial returns. You look at, for instance, some of the research that CFA and the CPA Institute have done on ESG, and you can find that there's a lot of strong metrics and drivers for ESG and business performance. So the first thing I would do is sort of point them to the research that's out there. Secondly, I would look at as I mentioned in my response to another question, what their peers are doing in terms of ESG. Invariably you'll see that your competitors in whatever industry you are have some kind of sustainability or ESG strategy. Even if you're not sort of bought into the whole like ESG creates financial returns sort of philosophy, at least you can look at ESG as a comparative driver or something that helps you differentiate from investors. So that's another way you can frame the importance of ESG, is just to gain a competitive advantage. So yeah, again, I would say like these are sort of the main two things. It's the first is just like education and capacity building, and secondly, it's to look at sort of your peers and competitors and what they're doing on sustainability. Great, and I think that was all so far. Hope that answered all of your questions, everyone. But if there's any other questions as well, we do have time, I think. So please feel free to drop them in the chat.
Vibhor, while we give the opportunity for any loose ends that may need to be answered, let's contextualize the next steps. We are all educators, and Ali has a question, so I give it to him.
Professor Ali.
But my point to you is this: is for people that are attending this seminar, if they want to actually get further training, educational opportunities, could you provide a little guidance? You went to U of T to do your master's. Was that a good experience? Do you have other suggestions where people can get credentials, expertise?
Yeah, that's a very good question and a very relevant question as well. Yeah, so I did a master's in sustainability management at U of T, which is a great program for anyone sort of interested in sustainability in general. Within our program, a lot of people focused on different things. So I focused on ESG, but other people focused on, for instance, sustainable agriculture or the energy sector. And our program sort of is very interdisciplinary in the sense that we have courses and perspectives from different subjects. So it really is sort of a holistic approach to sustainability, which I think is important. We also have an internship course built in to the master's program, where you're placed in sort of either it's a pension fund or a bank or another sort of ESG or sustainability company, where you're working day to day on some of these topics. So that's another way to get exposure. But putting sort of the more formal education component aside, I think We're at a very exciting time now where there's so much education out there that you can get for free, without doing sort of a dedicated master's program or specialized degree. A lot of people who ask me, what's the best way to get started on some of this, ESG stuff. I always recommend them to go to websites, for instance, such as the United Nations Principles for Responsible Investment website. UNITAR as well has a lot of great courses on ESG. You can go to, for instance, the TCFD website to learn about TCFD. They have a course and you can get a certificate and all of that as well. So there's plenty of research and training out there. A lot of it is like a very high quality and free as well. So I do recommend everyone who wants to further develop their skill set in this area to seek out those resources.
Thank you, Vibhor. Ali has a question, and I'll put a plug for York University, which is the university has an academic plan that goes up to 2025 that espouses the sustainable development goals. So if you want to study, York University has professors that specialize on sustainable development goals. And the Faculty of Business in particular focuses a great deal on ESGs and ethical investment and a number of very important programs, Faculty of Environmental and Urban Change, School of Engineering. Ali, over to you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Vibhor, for a very interesting and insightful presentation. I learned a lot. Thank you so much. One question that I have, and this was actually coming up as we had a meeting early before this session on ESG with our colleagues in UNITAR and CFAL network. And that was about the role of AI in today's situation and how that is going to impact the overall discussion and as well as strategic directions in ESG and so on. I mean, if there has been, I don't know, I'm sure there has been, especially when it comes to the risk perspective in ESG, etc. But I would like to hear from you. What's your take, and what do you think about AI? Everything related to AI with regard to ESG. Thank you.
Yeah, it's a good question, a very relevant question as well. You hinted at it there when you said that it can present both risks and opportunities, and I think we're seeing that duality in the ESG industry for sure. On the opportunity side, there's a lot of development and a lot of investment in ESG data solutions these days. So we're seeing a lot of startups that are focusing on providing investors with very accessible, for instance, climate data or like emissions data of their issuers. So a lot of these companies, they're trying to use AI in their tools to provide some of this data to investors. So I think, it's definitely an exciting space and one to keep an eye on. I think we're going to see a lot more application of AI into ESG and some of these startups and data tools going forward. But on the risk side, I think it's very important to, scope our excitement and also consider the very real risks of AI. One of them is obviously privacy. You have all these open AI tools where, a lot of times people don't understand or realize the risks, and they put a lot of sensitive information in there. And obviously now, anyone can access that information. So there are a lot of cybersecurity and privacy concerns as well with AI. And I know that, it's going to be an ESG risk that's incorporated into decision-making processes as well going forward. So yeah, plenty of opportunities, but also it's important to keep in mind the risks of AI as well.
Thank you. Thank you for a great answer.
Thank you.
So we're coming to the top of the hour. I think we can have a couple more questions if people have the burning desire to have them answered live. But our colleague Francesco has put the follow-up in the chat box of how you can remain in contact with us at CFAL York. Vibhor, I'm sure you'll have the last word. I don't want to expand on the artificial intelligence point, Ali, because I think you addressed it very well. Other than saying that the logical conclusion, when you look at the data, is that we're having a lot of decisions that are not taken with a lot of intelligence. A lot of people make decisions that defy reason. And I think one of the good things about this conversation is that it makes it clear that we need to incorporate a different set of parameters to decision making. One's, of course, for profitability, but more importantly, for the preservation of the planet. Without the planet, there's no economy. Without an economy, there's no community. So I think it's becoming clear to all of us that are doing work on indicators that the deterioration of specific parameters requires extra effort. And I want not to be that my concluding comment, but I think the SDGs are a good strategy to operationalize what needs to be done. Now that we need to operationalize it with budgets. And I think whether it's corporate, small scale, or governmental budgets, they all need to reflect the severity of the moment that we're living as a species. Preserving the planet should be the mission of all human beings. And ESG is a really good tool to actually get your house in order. At York University, we've done that with very specific governance decisions. And I wanted to mention that to the audience, since York University is one of the houses that has provided this opportunity, York U decided to guide its investment decisions, whether they're small or big, by looking at the local economy. How do we impact the local economy? Helps address UNSDG number 1, ending poverty. And now decisions about tenders, whether they're for services or goods, are not guided by price alone, but they're guided by whether there is a local component to that service or a good. So that's an additional definition of sustainability using the UNSDGs. In other words, ending poverty is essential to have a sustainable planet. And decisions can be made by large institutions like York University to ensure that investment, whether it's in goods and services, can favor the local economy. So I wanted to mention that to you because so many things are happening simultaneously that we lose track of what's paradigm shifting and what's just decoration. And by decoration, I mean the type of greenwashing that companies do to pretend that they're doing something useful, when what we actually need is to stop the pretense and actually begin to invest on creating prosperous local economies that are based on sustainability. So that is my concluding comments. And I want to give the opportunity to Ali to do some concluding comments and Vibhor to, of course, close this very interesting session because I don't see more questions in the chat box. But on behalf of myself and York University, I want to thank the organizers and, of course, Vibhor. We share alma mater. It's good to see that U of T was a good place for you to learn. York University is also a good place to learn. In fact, find a place where to learn so you can have a community of practitioners that accompany you on your ESG journey. Ali, Vibhor, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Professor Ashfari, for moderating this session and for your great concluding points. And also, again, I want to thank our speaker for a great talk. And this was the second session of our ESG in practice. We will continue. This is an area that requires, in my opinion, and what I can say on behalf of CFAL York, that we need to do a lot in terms of training, knowledge sharing, experience sharing, and develop a good basis for practice as needed. And that was the reason one of the reasons we put together this speaker series. And of course, it couldn't really happen without generous support of our speakers, those who already talked and those who are in line for this. If there is any opinion, suggestion, ideas about how to proceed with the future sessions, please let us know. You have our connections, emails, etc. With that, I'm going to let Francesco introduce our next session and go from there. Thank you so much, everybody, also for attending today's session.
Thank you very much. Yeah, I would just first like to echo my thanks as well to Dr. Jose for moderating the session, for Vibhor for that great presentation, and of course to our audience for participating, watching, and asking questions as always. We appreciate you all taking the time to be here. And yeah, for our next session, just a reminder, this series is on every second Wednesday of the month. So our next session will be September 13th at the same time, 12 p.m. Eastern Time. Our speaker for that session will be Prathmesh Raichura, who is a partner at Risk Consulting ESG, and their topic will be ESG and value creation. So if that is of interest to you, mark that on your calendars for the next session, and please feel free to continue sharing this series in your network with anyone who might find it useful or interesting. Registration is open until the very last session, so people can join at any time. So with that, thank you very much, and I will stop sharing my screen. And yeah, thank you to everybody once again. I hope everybody has a great day.
Thank you very much, everyone, for your great questions and engagement.
Thank you, everybody. Have a nice rest of your day.